I love to customize everything, including my composition book. So today's tutorial is a really fun and easy patchwork cover for your composition book. Let's get started. Check this out. I'm super excited about today's composition book cover. One, because I love to customize, like I said, but two, because I wanted to build a project for all of us that was focused on the use of 10-inch squares, because I always fall in love with these wonderful bundles of fabric. Today is Gypsy from Windham, and it's just another great line of fantastic and fun little prints. So I wanted to create covers that we could really mix up the parts and pieces so you could get extra scrappy and extra patchy with it if you want to, or you can make them kind of like I did, which is going to be a two fabric exterior cover. And then on the interior, we have a liner, and then we have little pockets or the sleeves that will hold the cover of the actual composition book. So the construction is very simple. Please bounce down into the description below. We have a free printable for you. And as you're getting ready to hit print on that, I want to just point out a couple of things here for you. If you're making your own style using just solid pieces of fabric, the diagrams have the finished sizes. The cut sizes down below in the list, those are the cut sizes I've used to make it patchwork. So we've kind of tried to set it up for you both ways so you can play with it and make it your own. Like I said, it's all about customizing. Now let's get into those parts and pieces because I'm dying to show you how it works. So the first thing we're going to build, and we're just going to use this as our reference, is what I'm going to call the liner. That's going to be this interior piece that's in there. And I'm going to start with 2 of my 10-inch squares. So this is what the piece looks like finished. Technically, it's just 10.5 by 16 inches. So if you're making it with your own piece of fabric, what I simply did is I took 2 10-inch squares and created this seam here first. So we're going to do that by going over to the sewing machine, right sides together on 2 10 squares, and everything's done with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And even though it's construction of gear, we're using cotton thread today. I'm not worried about seam allowances and structure of my thread today. We're going to do a lot of this construction because of the use of the 10-inch squares. We're going to sew on parts and pieces, and then we're going to slice them off to use for scrap and building. So I'm going to take this real quick, hit it with my iron. Okay, so now technically, I need to make a piece that's just 16 inches long as I go across here. So I can use my mat and come down here to 26, because I started at 10, that's why I said 26, sorry. Did that math quick in my head. Then I'm going to cut this piece off, and then what I do with this piece that's left over here is I basically divide it in half, and it's about 1 3/4. That piece there is then stitched together like that. That piece was sewn on, and you can see it go across here, and then the whole thing has just been, like I said, trimmed down to fit at a 10.5 by 16, and that's the interior cover. Now, let's get ready to do the exterior cover. That's where I think the magic is, because that's the part that everybody will get to see. So we're just going to set this aside for now. We're going to need that in a bit. Now the exterior cover, like I said, I'm excited, which means you know I'm trying to go too fast. So we're going to zen into this for a minute for you. We're going to use 3 10-inch squares. So what was originally built here, it's going to finish and look like this. This was 1 square, this was the 2nd square, and here's the 3rd square right here. We need to divide these pieces up to make them. This piece here was cut as a 7 by 10, which left a 3 by 10. That was stitched onto the bottom, just like you saw in the orange fabric a second ago, and then it was simply trimmed off, and then this was also trimmed to 10.5 inches tall that way. And then the center or the spine of our cover is made by a 3 by 10 and a 3 by 3 piece there. Those will have the exact same thing happen. I'm going to stitch those together along there. And then let me point out 2 other features as we come into the cover again. You can see that the spine was stitched on, but here I want to point out, this is where I'm keeping my seam allowance, and that's really fun if you have all of those down here, because these could be alternative fabrics. One of the reasons I built this using a bunch of different fabrics from the 10-pack was that I was thinking you could make all these cuts and then mix and scramble them and bring them all back together and have a ton of different looks in your journals. The other thing I want to point out, which I love, is some place to place our pen. It's just a simple piece of elastic. It's a 1-inch elastic with a little bit of extra firmness. It's got these ridges in it, but then it's 1 3/4 inches long, and that was folded and that was set into the seam 1 3/4 inches down from the top. So that was pinned into place as I sewed 2 of these fabrics to this fabric to make the exterior cover. And then once that was made, we have to put a little bit of interfacing in just to give it a little bit of structure and strength just on the exterior of the cover. So you can also see that I had a piece of interfacing that was cut at 10.5 by 16, and that was ironed on to the back side of the exterior cover. That's the only place we're going to use the interfacing. And I apologize, I forgot to tell you that. You saw it at the beginning in the supplies, but I was using the wonderful Heat and Bond Feather Light Fusible Interfacing. It's not the fusible web, it's an interfacing, and that gives us body right where we need it there. Okay, moving on. On the inside of our cover here, we're going to build 2 pockets that are going to match, but they have another fun fabric on the inside also, right? So let me show you how those work. So here's what our finished product is going to look like. Let me make a little bit more room so you can see. What I'm really going for is 2 pieces here, and these are going to be 7.5 by 10.5, always 10.5 is the height. You can see there's another piece of fabric here. We have all finished edges. You can see that I've pieced on. I'm going to show you how to do this here in a second, but what I want to point out is that my seam allowance is here, top stitched, seam allowance here, top stitched. And that way, when you put your journal together here, put it just the same, I have those same seams all running across there, and it just looks organized that way. It's not crucial, but I just thought I'd point that out. While we're building, that's what we're going for. Now, to get these pieces, you're gonna have 4 more squares. So we used a total of 9 squares in today's cover. And what we're doing is we're gonna take one of these here, and I'm gonna cut 2.5 inches off of it. These are 10-inch squares. So I'm just gonna come over here and I'm gonna count 2.5, looking at that line here. So that 2.5 is cut like this, okay? And now this piece is gonna be stitched onto the bottom, and it's up to you whether you want to sew it on and then trim it, or if you wanna trim it to begin with. However you like your construction. I was also trying to think of this as a great way to work with some of our younger sewers and quilters, making their own composition book covers. And I thought the more of these little skills we could teach folks, the more we'd get them hooked on quilting forever and ever, right? So part of my sneaking up on you becoming a quilter plan. Okay, so we're gonna hit this with the iron also. Like yay. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this edge I've been working with, and I'm going to trim it here. Okay, but I also only want it to be 10.5 inches tall. So here's another fun trick I can show you. Even if you're working with a ruler that's smaller than what you have to work with, then what I'm going to do, because I want to trim off the excess from the top, I want to leave that sew-on piece so it looks like I intended it to be there. Then I'm going to come down, and I'm going to come at where it's 10.5 along this line back here. And then what I can do is I can start to make my cut here, because I have a square line and a square line. Now I can move the ruler without moving the blade. Park it right there. I'm now looking at the square line across the back, and I'm going to just finish that cutout. So that worked there. And then I had this little piece floating about, perfect, or the exact size. Now what I want to do is, as I go right sides together, I want to keep both of these pieces down here at the bottom. Okay, so we're going to stitch one of these 2 sides. Now if I had one of these already made, this is the crucial part. Just make one and then prepare to make your second one. So let's say I want this fun minty color on the outside. That means that I want this to be right sides out. This is going to be underneath here, right sides down. When it's all done, that'll be my top stitch edge. So now what I do is I flip it over. I know this seems confusing, but I'm building it as I go to my sewing machine. I just switched it. Bottom came to top, and now my seam is where it needed to be as I approach the machine. All right, so now we have that where we need. We're gonna bring this over here, get ready to press it for the top stitching as well. So I'm gonna first kind of set my seam. Now I'm gonna fold it over so you can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Get that line up. Actually, I like to use my left hand also in there. There we go. So we get a nice little press. And now as I go to top stitch, I'm going to run not a 1/4 inch seam, but right on the edge. Putting that needle right where that seam is. And this is a great place to practice because later on we're going to top stitch as well. And we want a nice little fine top stitch. We don't want to go too deep. So practice it here where it's not important. Okay, now we have these pieces built. Now we're ready to construct the entire cover. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna start by building with our interior liner, and that's gonna be right sides up. I'm looking at all of my seams are gonna be at the bottom of the journal. So I said I wanted my green to now be my exterior of the inner pocket. That sounds like a big word. I'm going to line these up like this, and we're going to catch all of these seams at once. So if you were nervous that some of this was going to slip around, I guess you could put a pin in here, but then it would be hard to see. So I'm going to encourage you just to go ahead and make sure everything stays nice and square. I am now going to take, and I'm going to put that cover. I want to make sure again that I have all the bottoms lined up. I'm going to put the exterior cover. Now it's going right sides together, okay? Everything's right sides together, and we're going to sew around here about 80%. We're going to leave about a 3-inch opening over here on one end that we can let ourselves out. So I'm bringing us over. Now, my math is pretty accurate to fitting the composition cover. So we're going to make sure we do a 1/4 inch here because we don't want to let our seams get too deep because then we're going to have our covers be a little bit too small. I'm going to sew all the way off of the corner, leave my needle down and pivot at the corner instead of trying to guesstimate where the 1/4 inch is. And if you were watching very carefully, you'll notice that the other pocket just fell up and is out laying on the floor. So in a second, after I get this secured, I'm going to stop and I'm going to get that other pocket. We're just going to build the blooper reel into today's tutorial for you. But I'm not going to stop until I need that pocket, so I'm securing this all the way through. And I just finished securing the first pocket. It's right here where that spine basically ends. Now, excuse me a moment. This is what I was referring to. And remember, it was green sides up, but if you just can check, you can just look right here, it's easy. And I'm down here where my seam side was and my top stitches are into the center. So I'm just going to now bring this in, line up this back corner, line up this back corner, fold all of this over, lining up these corners first, because that's where I'm sewing to, pulling that edge, no problem whatsoever. However, maybe those pins wouldn't have been such a bad idea after all. Okay, let's get back to work here. So I'm just going to sew off this edge as well. Rotate. And because I did drop those pieces on the floor, I'm going to take an extra second. Let's get a stitch in here or two to hold it. Make sure it's nice at that corner. Now I'm just going to make sure everything stayed as it should have, and it's looking perfect. I'm not worried at all. One more rotation. And don't worry about those loops of thread. We're going to dog ear the corners in a second. Okay, I want to make sure my other pocket hasn't slipped from its top location, so I'm just going to double check that corner as well. Make sure everything's as it should be. And as I come around this fourth corner, don't sew it all the way closed. We have to let ourselves in so we can turn it right sides out. So again, about a 3 or 4 finger opening is all we're going to need. So I'm going to stop, I'm going to lock that stitching in, And now as I come off, because I want a really crisp and nice finished cover, I am going to dog ear the corner. So I'm not cutting into my stitching, I'm just cutting basically just right past where the cross of the thread was. Okay, nice and easy. Now I'm going to reach on in here and start to roll all of my stuff out. And then sometimes you have a little panic moment because the pocket comes out on one side. Don't worry, you got it, you did it right. Swing that around, and now I'm just already tending to those corners because my hand was right there. And a lot of times I'll put a purple thing or a stiletto or even the back end of my little Shark's rotary cutter up in there just to get the corners all crisp, because like I was saying a moment ago, we're going to now top stitch this to close up that back end, and that's where I'm going to start. And then we're also doing it for a nice finished look. So I'm going to get you started on that, and I'm going to show you one last trick. So just bear with me a second while I tend to these corners. You can't rush this motion. Beautiful. Okay. Now, one of the things I like to do before I top stitch is I like to try to get this seam, because again, I really want the smallest amount of seam allowance. I don't want to take any extra. So I'm just going to take this, kind of hold it, carefully bring in my iron to try to set a crease, like yay. And now as I come over here and begin my top stitching, again, I'm just going to stay just right along this edge, because if we make too deep of a top stitch, we're going to actually start to reduce our seam allowance, and that's going to make it so that the cover doesn't fit perfectly. And I told you I have a trick for that, so let me show you. We're just going to go right along this edge here, and I'm just going to take you to one corner, because now instead of sewing off of the corner, because it still has a little bit of a rounded effect, I'm going to give it a couple of stitches, and then I'm going to swing it, one more stitch, swing it all the way, boom, boom, and now I'm again right on that edge, and I've got a really clean, nice top stitch as I go along there. Now, let me show you what I'm referring to with one of these finished journals. Here you can see the actual top stitching again. It goes all the way around. It was a continual motion, right? But I had one that I put it together and it was a little bit snug. So let me show you. The much easier solution than cutting out all that beautiful stitching work is you can go in here to one of your journals and you can take a razor knife and you can just shave the edge of that, or you can just shave any of your composition book covers themselves that are just not fitting because you did such a beautiful job with your journal. Leave the seam ripper sheathed today and just pull out the razor knife and take care of business the old-fashioned way, like we love to do right here at Mansewing. But before I let you go today, I want to hear from all of you. What did you think of the actual patchwork version of the composition cover? I thought it was genius. I hope you did too. We'll see you next time at Mansewing. Oh, hey, are you still in here? I thought you would have been checking out some of those other great videos. You know, we've got a link there, over there. And hey, don't forget to subscribe. Make sure you never miss a minute of the action. We'll catch you next time at Mansewing.